of you. So I am excited about this class because I love history and love Judaism, and so this combines two of them. So okay, so what I thought, the kind of subject came up. I thought it would be interesting to kind of look at Jewish history through the lens of debate and controversy. Now, remember, whenever you study history, you're always kind of telling a story. You know, there's really no such thing as objective history. Just simply choosing which facts to mention is itself a story. So, so we have to pick our lens of Jewish history through which we evaluate how we understand what happened. So if an Orthodox rabbi was teaching a class on Jewish history, his emphasis would be different than if a Reform rabbi is. If just a regular historian, a critical historian at a university teaches Jewish history, her emphasis would be different than mine. So how we choose to teach history itself reflects our own biases. So that's just important to understand. So I thought trying to be not objective, but as interesting as possible, to look at history through the lens of different debates and controversies, because we all know that standard joke, two Jews, three opinions, all true. And there have been many divisions throughout Jewish history. And so just like in any history, I mean, think of America, we look at today as a very divisive time, which is true, but there have been divisions in American history going back to the Revolution, right? I mean, look at the campaign between Jefferson and Adams in 1796 and in 1800. I mean, they were vicious. So there have been controversies throughout American history, throughout Jewish history. So we're going to look at these throughout Jewish history. And I'm going to give you just a brief overview of what we're going to do, and then we're going to get right into the first one. So I picked 7 different controversies. And the first is what we're going to talk about today. And that's the controversy, the differences between the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes, which were the 3 primary groups of Jews during what's called the Second Temple period. Second Temple period goes from about 531 BCE to 70 CE, so a good 600 years. And these were the 3 main groups, and they were totally different. The second session, we're going to look at the controversy between Maimonides and what's called the anti-Maimonideans. Maimonides, we revere him today as the greatest rabbi of the Middle Ages, but his philosophy was extremely controversial because he essentially allegorized he rejected a lot of the traditional ways of interpreting Torah and replaced them with a totally more abstract approach. And so we're going to look at that controversy, which is very interesting. Third controversy is going to be the emergence of the Hasidic movement. And remember, we think of the Hasids as sort of a standard Orthodox movement today, but in their time, they were rejected by nearly the entire Orthodox community, who were mostly Lithuanian and the more strict Talmudic interpretation. The Hasids were seen as total outsiders and essentially peasants. They were seen as the illiterate, the not so bright group, and yet the Hasids emerged as a major movement. So we're going to look at that controversy. Then we're going to look, and this is related to modernity versus the traditionalists, that the people who wanted to modernize Judaism in the 18th, 19th century, essentially some of the early reformers, but not just reform. This is just generally the more Enlightenment period versus the sort of retrenchment. Then we're going to look at controversy among the modernizers. So we're going to look at the difference between conservative and Reform Judaism and how that difference emerged, because initially they were part of the same group, but then they divided. And then in the 6th session, we're going to look at an enduring controversy, and that's Zionism. So the Zionists versus the anti-Zionists. And then for the last session, we're going to look at contemporary controversies, conflict. And that's, I'm not quite sure what we're going to focus on. I probably will focus on kind of the sort of survivalists versus those who are looking in terms of Judaism as meaning, and kind of how do we craft Jewish identity today, and what are the differing points of views? So that's kind of a general overview of how I want to see the class kind of evolve. And of course, you know my style. I love questions, discussion. But let's start. Let's start with this: the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. Now, go back in time. You know, we see the origins of Judaism as Moses leading the people out of Egypt. That's all part of it. That's all. But that is kind of biblical Judaism. And biblical Judaism really rests in the existence of a Jewish state. That is the land of Israel governed by a monarchy, you know, King David, King Solomon. And that era of Jewish history essentially ends in 586 BCE. It starts to end even earlier, but really the final ending is 586 BCE. And Judaism at that point could easily have died, Instead, it reformulates itself. And you know, that's a whole story as to how that happens. A subject for a different class. But by 531 BCE, the temple has been rebuilt and Jews are still living in the land of Israel, but they're not an independent state. Essentially, the land of Israel is part of the Persian Empire. And over time, a process called Hellenization happens. So remember, Alexander the Great conquers all of the ancient Near East. Alexander the Great is trained, embodies, spreads Greek philosophy and Greek ways of life, the Hellenist. That's the scholarly term. And the Jewish community is absolutely shaped by Hellenistic thinking, Hellenistic ways of life. And this creates tension within the Jewish community because the elites, you know, every society has elites, and the elites in ancient Jew, or in Second Temple Jewish life, were the priests. These were the priesthood. Now, the priesthood was never meant to be an elite. It was meant to be, you know, the poor, suffering servants of God, but that's not how it worked out. The priests were essentially the link between the civil authorities and the people, and they also governed the temple. And the temple was not just the religious center of life, but there was no monarchy. So the temple was also kind of the cultural and the social and the political center of Jewish life. And the priesthood ran the temple. So the priesthood became a pretty corrupt institution. And the people who were sort of the head of the priesthood were called Sadducees. Sadducees. People think the word Sadducee derives from tzedek, from the word justice. Nobody's quite certain of the etymology of it. But the Sadducees were the sort of governing group of Jewish life. And they embraced Hellenistic culture. They wanted Jews to be more like Greeks. And famously, there was a period of time where the Hellenists placed a statue of Zeus in the temple and all this. And then we have Hanukkah, which comes later, the Hasmoneans. But even before then, opposition arose to the Sadducees. And the opposition were mainly popular teachers of Torah who were not priests, but they believed strongly in living a life of Torah, a life of learning. And this group was called the Pharisees. And the word Pharisee derives from the Hebrew word perush. Perush means several things, like we think parashah. It can mean to explain, but its root meaning, its sort of basic meaning is to separate. And that's when you think, thinking is making distinctions between things. And so to perush is to separate, to divide out ideas. And essentially the idea of the Pharisees were, we are a separate people. We are not Greeks, we are not Hellenists, we are Jews, and we should embody a separate way of life. So the Pharisees essentially rejected Hellenism. Although interestingly, many scholars say the Pharisees wouldn't exist if it were not for Hellenism, because Greek thought spread the idea of democracy. right? Not prototypical democracy governed, it had its problems, but essentially there was a Greek idea of the importance of the people, the polis. And the Pharisees were the people. They weren't the governing group. They were just, lower middle class folk. And so their authority derived in some ways because of the spread of Hellenism, yet they rejected Hellenism. They truly wanted to embody a separate way of life. And they started to embrace the practices of the priesthood, even though they weren't priests, such as hand washing, the way they ate, certain things that generally were reserved for the priests, the Pharisees started to do. And they were teachers. They were the popular teachers of Torah. Now, we're going to get back to the Pharisees and the Sadducees more. I just want to introduce the Essenes. Now, the Essenes are a really interesting group. No one knows exactly when they emerged, but it wasn't just the Pharisees who responded to the corruption of the priesthood. There were priests who were fed up with other priests. They thought the other priests were not religious enough and too corrupt. So this group of Sadducees left the city and they went and they lived in caves. And the caves that we know now are the Dead Sea caves, the caves of Qumran by the Dead Sea. And this group, which was known as the Essenes, were former priests who left the city of Jerusalem. And what was interesting about the Essenes is they embraced an ascetic way of life. They were generally didn't have children, didn't marry. They only grew because they would bring in people who converted. They were apocalyptic. They believed the end of the world was coming, and they had to prepare themselves for that end of the world. There's lots of references in the text of the Dead Sea. They had a big library at the Dead Sea. It wasn't just Torah. They had a tremendous library, and there were constant references to the sons of light and the sons of darkness fighting each other. And so the Essenes were a kind of a sect that really believed the end of the world was coming, and they were also very communal. There was no personal property among the Essenes. There was a very strict observance of Shabbat. And also the Essenes were very famous because the men went in the mikveh every day. That was a constant ritual immersion. The Essenes were obsessed with purity of spirit, purity of body. And it kind of made sense. They were separating themselves totally. They were already pious because they were priests. They were kind of, the regular priests weren't pious enough for them. Interestingly, many scholars believe that John the Baptist, well, the text itself says John the Baptist came from an Essene family, which John the Baptist, of course, baptism is just another name for mikveh. I mean, it's an adaptation of mikveh, but the whole idea is the same. You ritually immerse yourself in water and purify yourself. So that was a very central custom to the Essenes. And the Essenes, we know so much about them mainly because of Josephus. So this whole period of Second Temple Judaism, the first person to kind of write about this extensively is Josephus. Now, Josephus was a Pharisee. Many people believe he was a Pharisee who fought in the revolts against Rome in 70 CE. When he saw that the battle was lost, he switched sides and became essentially a teacher among the Romans. He was well accepted. He was clearly a very bright guy. And he became a chronicler, a historian for the Roman Empire, writing about the Jews. He was always Jewish, but he essentially served to write the history of the Jewish people. And he wrote several books which were preserved by the church. Many of the great books of Hebrew literature, the book of Maccabees and so forth, only survived because they were preserved in monasteries, which is whole interesting story. But his books were preserved by the church and he actually mentions there's a mention of Jesus, one mention of Jesus in his books. The story of the Sadducees, the Essenes, and the Pharisees are really told first by Josephus, and then scholars, elaborated on them. So let's go back to a little kind of how each of these groups emerged. Now, we talked about the Sadducees, let's talk a little bit about the differences between the groups and how they emerged. So the Sadducees, of course, are the legacy priesthood. They were Kohanes, and they had certain ideas, theologies that were different, or that were, I think probably maybe the best word is fundamentalist. They were kind of fundamentalist in their thinking, fundamentalist in terms of how they read the Bible. So first, they believed that there is no afterlife. There's no resurrection of the dead. It's simply this life, and that's it. And that's generally the view of the Hebrew Bible, right? The Hebrew Bible has a place where people go, where the souls of the dead go after they die. It's called Sheol, but there's no afterlife. There's no extensive discussion of what happens next. And that's the belief the Sadducees had. Whereas the Pharisees had a very strong belief in the afterlife. It's a very interesting distinction. The Pharisees believed that there was a heaven and a hell. Now, not as we can, most people understand them today. It's not like hell is some fiery burning pit and heaven is some, angels with harps. That's not, but the Pharisees did believe in some sort of afterlife with reward and punishment. Whereas the Sadducees said, you live and you die and that's it. Second, the Sadducees believed very strongly in free will, that every human being has a choice, good or evil, and it's up to us. There's no fate. There's no predestination. We choose and we act, and that's live with the consequences. Pharisees are a little bit more, what you might say, conservative in that regard, in that they believe, there may be a kind of image of free will, and it seems like we have free will, but ultimately God is in charge, and we don't quite understand God's ways. Whereas the Sadducees were a bit more, this is what God really isn't in charge, which is interesting because they're the priesthood. So you would expect them to be kind of more religious or traditional on this regard. But remember, this is a very important, Judaism does not start as a religion. Judaism starts as a people, as a nation. So religious beliefs are constantly in flux as circumstances change. And so the Sadducees kind of reflected, in many ways, the influence of Hellenism in their thinking. Even though they are, in a sense, supposed to be the most pious, they're also the most influenced by the outer culture, because they're interacting more with the outer culture than any other group. So the Sadducees believe there's no afterlife, there's total free will, whereas the Pharisees believe there is an afterlife and there isn't free will. The Sadducees, another interesting, Sadducees rejected the idea of angels, whereas the Pharisees talk extensively about angels and the role of angels in life. So you can kind of see these interesting distinctions emerge. And then finally, perhaps most importantly, the Sadducees embraced Hellenization. They wanted Jews to essentially be more like Greeks, whereas the Pharisees, as I said earlier, rejected that. Now, how did this conflict play out? Well, in general, the Sadducees are gradually losing power throughout the Second Temple period. And the reason they are is, one, they're corrupt, and two, essentially, the holiday we now know as Hanukkah starts as a war between, the Antiochus and the Israelites and Jews living in Palestine. However, there's another conflict essentially between the pro-Hellenistic wing of Judaism and the anti-Hellenistic wing of Judaism. And the pro-Hellenistic wing of Judaism is essentially fine with Antiochus. They say, he's the king, might as well just, go along to get along. Sure, we can have a statue of Zeus in the temple. Yes, we can talk, we can praise the Roman emperor, as long as, we're not going to convert to another religion, but we can essentially adapt Judaism as, whereas the anti-Hellenizers say, absolutely not. We're the chosen people. We're meant to be a part. We're going to fight this. And the anti-Hellenizers win, essentially. Now it wasn't so strictly the Pharisees and the Sadducees at that point. That division had not totally emerged yet, although it would a little bit later. But the ideas were the same. So the anti-Hellenizers win. So that reduces the power of the Sadducees. However, what happens is, once the Maccabees came into power, they essentially became Sadducees. It's like power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. We don't often tell that part of the Hanukkah story, is that the Maccabees, within about a generation or two, become just as corrupt as the people they replaced. And so that's really when the Pharisees become a much more powerful group, in that they're seen as really the representatives of the people. So what did the Pharisees believe? Now, this is important. The origins, now, as I said before, the Pharisees are generally middle class, lower middle class. These are the peasant folk. These are not the elites who live in Jerusalem and work in the temple. That's a very small group among these are people who are out in the countryside, but they are literate, because generally literacy is valued in Jewish culture even from early on, and they are teachers. People, as I said, the word Pharisee comes from Perush, but there also is a line of thinking that believes the Pharisees, the initial Pharisees were scribes. Every town had scribes, people whose job it was to write things out. And these were not priests, but they were learned. So this is a very important distinction. These were people who were not, they were farmers, they were learned, but they weren't priests. So they were kind of an in-between. And those were probably the first Pharisees. And the Pharisees, as I said before, they believed in resurrection. They believed in adopting priestly habits. They also were popular healers. This is one interesting thing about the Pharisees, is that they would do healings of people. Now we kind of think we poo-poo on that today, that, oh, faith healers and so forth, it's all crazy, which it probably is. But at the time, they were very popular. And there's all kinds of stories in the Talmud about these popular healers who would cast out demons from people's souls. And the Pharisees did that. The priests, they didn't bother with that. That was, folk religion, whereas the Pharisees did. And so again, kind of understand why they were popular teachers. And so over time, the Pharisees grow in importance, and they become a more influential group as time goes on. As the power of the priesthood declines, the power of the Pharisees increases. And there are numerous examples throughout the text of the Pharisees and the Sadducees debating. Now, I want to bring up a chart. Let me find this here. I'm going to share my screen in a second once I get this up here. Okay, I got a good chart here. Okay, no, that's not the one. Okay, here we go. Okay, I'm going to pull this up. Okay, I'm going to hold on. I'm going to share my screen. Let's see here. PDF. Okay, here we go. Okay, can everyone see this? Okay, so this is a kind of chart a little bit about where they differed with each other and some of their kind of different, their different locations. Yes, this is very important. It's very important. Ignore the Essenes for now. We'll get back to them, but they're essentially, the Essenes are relatively unimportant. because they die off very quickly. But we'll get back to them. So this one, the law, the Sadducees have no interest in Talmud. Essentially, they are very, as I said before, very fundamentalist. The biblical law is the only law. Whereas the Pharisees, they develop what ultimately becomes the Talmud is the result of the discussion of the Pharisees, that they are interpreting Torah for the masses. And as they're interpreting over time, it gets written down. Now, one of the core texts of the Pharisees, it's a text from Exodus where it says, all the people of Israel are priests. Now, this essentially is a proto-democratic idea. Now, we know the priesthood exists, but the text seems to say in the ideal world, everybody is a priest, that there is no hierarchy. And so the Pharisees kind of are starting to move towards that area. Now we see their interpretation, pragmatic, accommodating for the Sadducees. They wanted to get along with the Hellenists. The Pharisees were very academic, very precise. Yeah, interestingly, this is what I said before. God doesn't, for the Sadducees, God is not involved in the affairs of the world, whereas for the Pharisees, God is. I talked about fate before. This is interesting. Society, the Pharisees, or at least the way they're depicted, they were kind and loving towards each other, whereas the Sadducees are mean to each other. Okay, interestingly. Now, this is also very, very important. Their location. The Sadducees are in the urban areas. The Pharisees are in the rural. They're the countryside. Now, isn't this an interesting theme throughout history? That always, the urban versus the rural. I mean, we have that in America today. I mean, that you can overlay. I mean, take a look at like a map of red counties and blue counties in big states, and you see that the urban centers are almost always blue and the more rural centers are always red. There's always differences between urban and rural. By the way, I once watched a documentary on prohibition. The whole prohibition movement in the United States was an urban versus rural conflict. But that, you know, but in any ways, this goes all the way back here. The Pharisees are generally associated with the countryside, whereas the Sadducees are rural. Right, live simply, sought wealth. All right, we talked about all this. Okay, so I see we have some things in the chat. Oh yes, I can. We'll send the chart out. Absolutely, we'll send the chart out. Any questions so far? Any questions so far about the Pharisees and the Sadducees? I'm going to get back to seeing faces. Let me get rid of the screen share. Any questions? Okay. I want to go back to what happens with the Pharisees. So the Pharisees, as I said, their power increases as the priesthood decreases. Now, by the time in 70 CE, the temple is destroyed. The second temple is destroyed by the Romans. Now, this is a monumental moment in Jewish history. Now, so many things that we understand as modern Judaism come out of this destruction. So the first thing of importance is that the priesthood, the Sadducees, are essentially gone. Now, the priesthood still exists today. We have Kohens, we have Levites. You know, it's kind of it's a tiny remnant of what once was, but the priesthood is gone. And the Essenes, they're out living in the Dead Sea caves. They're very small. They don't have, you know, they're so the only group left standing is the Pharisees. That's it. They're the only ones. And what they are, the Pharisees, there's a very famous story in the Talmud, which is almost certainly not true, but it's a great story. And what's good about the story is that it kind of reveals the rise of the Pharisees, essentially. So the story is that as the Romans surrounded Jerusalem, they trapped the people inside, essentially. But there was a radical group that if any Jew in Jerusalem wanted to escape, this group would kill them. these were the zealots who were Sadducees. These were Sadducees who who wanted to defend the temple. I mean, that was their livelihood. So could not escape. If you were Jewish and you wanted to escape from Jerusalem at almost certain death, you'd be killed by the people standing within the walls of Jerusalem. So what happened was, there's in the Bible, in Torah, it says you cannot be buried in Jerusalem. Can't be buried. So what they did was the Pharisees created a coffin. They made a coffin, and they put Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who's a great Pharisaic teacher. He's not really a rabbi then. The title rabbi doesn't exist back then, but people just refer to him as rabbi, and I'll explain why later. They put Yochanan ben Zakkai in the coffin, and his students carry him to the gate, and they say, we can't bury him here. He's our great teacher. We have to bury him outside the city. At first, the zealots don't believe them, but ultimately they relent, and the coffin is allowed to leave the city. When they get outside the city, Rabbi, they open the door, they open the coffin. Yochanan ben Zakkai comes out. Yochanan ben Zakkai negotiates with the Roman general. Now, this is why it's probably apocryphal. There's no chance he would have, but he negotiates with the Roman general, who is very happy because it's the emperor's birthday that day. And so as a result of this negotiation, the Roman Empire says, okay, we'll let you live, and you can create a little town. Once we conquer Jerusalem, we'll let you live freely in a town called Yavna, and you can establish a yeshiva, a school in Yavna. And so Yochanan ben Zakkai and his students are free to go and build a society in Yavna, and soon after the temple is destroyed. But Yavna remains. And Yavna is the site, is essentially the birthplace of rabbinic Judaism. And so what this story tells us is essentially the Pharisees become the rabbis. And that makes total sense, because the rabbis, essentially their role in early Judaism is teachers of Torah and deliverers of perushim, of explanations. And they are also, their beliefs are much more reflective of the Pharisaic beliefs. First, the importance of Talmud, of oral Torah, of resurrection of the dead. This is, we don't talk about this much in modern Judaism, but this is a sort of foundational belief in rabbinic Judaism. The importance of fate and predetermination and so forth. All of these are sort of foundational beliefs of rabbinic Judaism. Again, as Reformed Jews today, we don't talk about some of these ideas, but they really are fundamental. So this essentially, when the Romans conquer Jerusalem, the Sadducees die, and the only group remain standing are the Pharisees. And the Pharisees, over time, become known as the rabbis. The first reference to a group called the rabbis is actually in the Gospels. The Gospel of Matthew refers to the rabbis. That's the first time it's used. Ultimately, it becomes very common to use it. They're called ha-chachamim. So ha-chachamim means the wise ones. And they chart the course of Judaism at that point. Now, you may remember that the Pharisees were anti-elitist, essentially. And now it seems like they are a new elite. And that's true. They are. However, their elitism is much different. Firstly, it's merit-based. It's merit. How did you become a rabbi, a teacher? You were a scholar. You weren't born into it. Like the priesthood, you're born into the priesthood. But you are not born into the rabbinate. You earn it. That's why there's a famous text in Pirkei Avot. There's the crown of priesthood. There's a crown of monarchy, and then there's a crown of a good name. The crown of a good name reflects the rabbinic point of view. In addition, the Pharisees, essentially, what happens as a result of the triumph of the Pharisees, Judaism becomes small. It's a very interesting point. A lot of historians don't talk about this. There was a period of time when sort of Jews, or at least connected to Jews, were 10% of the Roman Empire. But after the destruction of the temple, when you have the rise of Christianity and the rise of the Pharisees essentially say, we are going to be a leaner and meaner group. We are going to be small and devout. We're not interested in people joining us. We are simply interested in preserving our way of life, our communities. And so there's a book that was written recently by a professor at Northwestern where he argues that during the next 400 years after the destruction of the temple, the number of Jews declines significantly, primarily because of the expectation of literacy. That if you were Jewish and you didn't educate your children, it was much easier to essentially become Christian because that wasn't an expectation. And so the number of Jews declines significantly because it's a very small group, and ultimately ends up being much more urban. The Pharisees' origins are in rural areas, but they become a more urban people as they leave the countryside and move more towards the city. And they over the next 100 years after the destruction of the temple, many rabbinic leaders moved to Babylonia rather than stay in Palestine. And I'll explain that in a minute, but we have a question. Yeah, go ahead. Evie and Gail.
Well, I was just going to reflect. I took a class once in New Testament, and it seems to me that I recall that that the early Christians, as offshoots of Jews, initially kept all the Jewish laws, but added onto it a belief in Jesus. Whereas by the time Matthew comes along, he says, no, you don't have to keep kosher, and you don't have to do keep a lot of the commandments which are clearly in the Torah. And that surely has to have some ramifications to the decline in Jews and rise of other religions.
No question. So you're right. So this is such a murky period of history. So it's kind of hard to say definitively how it all happened. Mm-hmm. But yes, there's no question the first Christians were Jews. But the first people that ultimately led to the creation of Christianity were Jewish followers of Jesus. And after Jesus died, this group of Jewish followers of Jesus essentially believed he was the Messiah, whereas other Jews, including former Jewish followers of Jesus, said, no, he's not. He died. But this group of Jewish followers of Jesus survives and grows, and then is sort of put into hypergear by the destruction of the temple. So the destruction of the temple leads to all these different offshoots. So the Jewish followers of Jesus are mostly outside of Jerusalem by this point, so they're not hurt as much by the destruction of the temple. Whereas the more traditional Jewish followers of Jesus, many of them are killed during the destruction of the temple. So Christianity could have gone multiple ways. They could have become a sect within Judaism. That would have been perfectly fine. I mean, there's a sect within Judaism today of people who believe that, Menachem Schneerson was the Messiah. I mean, they're small, but they're a sect. So essentially, the Jewish followers of Jesus could have remained a sect within Judaism. But because of the destruction of the temple, their more traditional elements of that sect were killed, and those living outside of Jerusalem are the ones who survived, and they are much more open to proselytizing and bringing in Gentiles. And so since that group survives, they essentially become more and more separate from the original Jews, so to speak, who are in Jerusalem. And then, of course, you've got Paul, who is a brilliant propagandist in a way for this new sect. And under Paul's leadership, it grows significantly. And a big part of it is the fact that you didn't have to keep kosher. You didn't have to follow the laws of Torah. Another part could be the literacy element, although that comes later. But definitely, and again, a lot of it is rooted in the destruction of the temple. And essentially, the Pharisees and the Jewish followers of Jesus are the two groups who kind of emerge out of that destruction of the temple. And they probably are from the same pool of people, right? I mean, Akiba and Paul could well have known each other. They could have well studied together. And Akiba ultimately becomes the leader of rabbinic Judaism, whereas Paul becomes the leader of the Jewish followers of Jesus. They're both emerging out of this very destructive, creative period of the first century. Other questions? Who else had their hand up? Yeah, also circumcision was no longer, yes, that's a big thing. That's a big thing because that limits that limits the number of people who are willing to convert. So if you say circumcision isn't an issue, it's easier to get people to convert. Yeah, who is next?
Meredith.
Paul was very proud to claim to be a Pharisee.
Yes, yes. And interestingly, so the Pharisees are given a bad reputation in the Gospels. They're seen as strict and legalistic, but the truth is they were the much more flexible, as we've started to see, they were the much more flexible group within early Judaism. And in addition, the early Christians probably came from the Pharisaic group within Judaism. So that actually makes a lot of sense, right? If you are separating from your origins, you are going to criticize those origins. So the fact that the gospel writers are critical of the Pharisees probably indicates their closeness to the Pharisees. Because what did Freud talked about, the narcissism of small differences? So the Pharisees and the followers of Jesus are not that different. They have the issue of Jesus, but even the issue of Jesus, it seems like a huge issue to us, which it is. But at the time, it was, people believed in Messiah and messianic figures. That was not, Jesus wasn't the only person that Jews believed was the Messiah. There were many others, including throughout history, which we'll get to in one of our other classes. We'll talk a little bit about Sabbatai Tzvi later. But the idea of Jesus being the Messiah is not that big a deal in early Judaism. It becomes a big deal later. So the differences are relatively small. There's a great scholar named Daniel Boyarin. His father taught at the University of Chicago, and he teaches at Berkeley. And he wrote a book. I forget what it's called. It might be called The Jewish Gospels. I read it a long time ago. And what he essentially says is that in the first century of the Common Era, it would be very difficult to tell the difference between a Jewish follower of Jesus and a Pharisee. They were constantly borrowing ideas from each other, and certain ideas, like we don't know whether this was a Jewish influence on early Christians or an early Christian influence on the Pharisees, that they were there was constant interaction. It's only later that the lines solidify. And the reason, he says, the reason the line solidified was political, that the Roman Empire essentially said, we are going to ban these monotheists, these followers of Jesus. And so the followers of Jesus said, wait, it's not us who are so bad. It's the Jews, it's the Pharisees. It's those people. They're the ones who killed Jesus. We will be good Roman citizens. The render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and unto God what is God. These Jews are the ones who are the bigger problem. We can, in fact, help the Roman Empire. We can bring people in. We're peaceful. We're pacifist. We're not going to revolt like the Jews revolted. And so it's a result of Roman political. The Romans essentially the Romans created divisions between the Jewish followers of Jesus and the Pharisees. And essentially, because the Jewish followers of Jesus by that time, now we're talking probably 150 to 200 BC, or not BC, CE. By that time, the Jewish followers of Jesus are much greater numbers than the Pharisees and the rabbis. And then in 130 CE, there's one final revolt. Remember, led by, I can't believe I'm blanking on his name, very famous another messianic figure. That revolt is crushed. And so the Romans essentially say, okay, as long as you Jesus followers are peaceful, pay your taxes, it's Judaism we're going to outlaw and forbid. So it's through the coercive political influence of the Roman Empire that the final split is between the Jewish followers of Jesus and the Pharisees. It could have gone multiple ways. And it's then that Judaism essentially becomes a very small. I think I read somewhere that at a certain point, the number of Jews drops by 2/3 during this period of time between 100 and 500 CE. That Jews were around six. I don't know. I don't remember the exact numbers, but it drops by almost 70% as many Jews die in wars, and you're not allowed to convert to Judaism anymore. And the other groups are growing much faster. So Judaism essentially becomes a tiny minority religion. And that's how we stay and still are. We still are a very small religion. And think about it. Somebody once said that the entire Jewish population would be considered a small statistical error in a Chinese census. Isn't that remarkable? We're tiny. And that's only been true for the last 2,000 years. As I said earlier, at one point, Jews and there's a new term that sociologists use called Jewish adjacent, which is like the term used for non-Jews that are married to Jews, people that are connected to Judaism but may not have converted, so forth. They're called Jewish adjacent. And so I'm going to apply that term back 2,000 years. At a certain point, Jews and Jewish adjacent were 10% of the Roman Empire. That quickly dropped, not quickly, but it dramatically drops. And that's a result of the rise of Christianity, the political coercion of the Roman Empire, and the narrowing of Judaism. So the Pharisees, now Gail pointed out in the chat that Jacob Pedakowski, who was a professor at Hebrew Union College, wrote a wonderful book. I have it somewhere in my library that it's very hard to find these days. Happy I have a copy. It's called Heirs to the Pharisees. And it essentially, Pedakowski connected the Pharisees to the founders of Reform Judaism, where he said the Pharisees were a break with the priesthood. The priesthood symbolized the old Judaism, the corrupt Judaism, the sort of fundamentalist Judaism, whereas the Pharisees were reformers in that they democratized and liberalized Judaism. And similar to the reformers of the 19th century who democratized and liberalized Orthodox Judaism. It's a good argument, although the problem is the Pharisees were very, very conservative. They believed that strict observance of God's law was the obligation of Jews, and that if you couldn't do circumcision, if you couldn't keep kosher, you might as well not be Jewish, because you were, go be a Jewish follower of Jesus. They were very strict about their observance of the law, and they were also very politically passive. This is another aspect of it, that the Pharisees made the decision that there's no purpose in revolting against the Roman Empire again, because we'll lose. That story I told you about Yochanan ben Zakkai illustrates that. Rather agree, surrender, leave me alone. Let me form a yeshiva. We'll pay taxes, but let us sit and study. So the kind of Pharisees become a smaller group. And this actually explains why the Essenes, I said I'd get back to the Essenes. The Essenes die out. By the 200 to 300 CE, the Essenes, the Dead Sea sect, is gone. Their scrolls are buried in caves, which is a remarkable story how those scrolls are discovered. But some scholars say many of the Essenes ultimately become Pharisees. And because the Pharisees, or they join the Pharisaic groups, because the Pharisees are a very small group. And the Pharisees make their way to Babylonia, where they set up the famous yeshiva in Babylonia, and Jewish life ultimately leaves the land of Israel behind. There's always a small group there, but the Pharisees kind of migrate Judaism out of Palestine to Babylonia. Why? Well, Babylonia is more of a commercial center, and so there's just essentially more jobs, and the temple doesn't exist anymore. So there's really no reason to be in Palestine. There's no reason to be there. There's a very famous, this class is about controversies. One of the big controversies is between the Palestinian Pharisees and the Babylonian Pharisees. And the conflict is over the calendar. So people ask me occasionally, why do we celebrate 2 days of Rosh Hashanah? Why do we have an extra day of Sukkot, an extra day of Passover, and so forth? Even though it's a 7-day holiday, but we celebrate for 8 days. Well, before there were computerized calendars, the new month was determined by the sight of the moon. It was we're a lunar calendar. So who determines the full moon? Well, in earlier times, it was Palestinian rabbis who would go up on a hill, and when there was a new moon, it was a new moon and a new month. But when Jews go to Babylonia, who determines it? Is it the rabbis in Babylonia or the rabbis in Palestine? And they disagree. The rabbis in Babylonia say, we can't wait for the Palestinian rabbis to send a scout to tell us that the new moon is happening, because we might miss it. The scout might not ever get there in time, and we would have the wrong day. So we're going to have our own people determine when the new moon is. Whereas the Palestinians say, we're not going to give up who determines when the new moon has arisen. That's our job. And so ultimately the compromise is we're going to celebrate 2 new moons. Essentially, we're going to have 2 days when the new moon is determined. And that's why there's an extra day added on to each holiday, so that we make sure we do it on the right day. So that's all goes back to who's in charge of determining the calendar. And that's between where is the center of Jewish life? Is it in Babylonia or is it in Palestine? And those conflicts still happen today. Which is the primary Jewish community in the world? Is it American Jews or is it Israel? Well, right now it's probably Israel, because Israel has a bigger Jewish community than America. But prior to the state of Israel, it was America, and prior to America, it was Europe. So there's conflicts that are determined in many ways by geography and politics and all that. Okay, we got a lot of questions. Evie, go ahead.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for this wonderful overview, because I've always found all those Sadducees, et cetera, so confusing every time I've heard them. So your description was very helpful. However, I almost feel like we're dealing with new wine in old bottles or whatever it is, because I don't know that any of that's been really clarified present day. I think we keep struggling with, who we follow, what we follow, just the varieties within basic Judaism, and just the transitions of all the other possibilities. And I think maybe it's a questioning that perhaps keeps us vibrant. The things that you reject, you said something about rejecting something and then or moving away and rejecting, and then finding something new. In a way, I find it refreshing, and not so much ancient history, but just a continuum.
Sure. I mean, yes, these conflicts absolutely continue in different forms, right? I mean, there are major differences today between Jewish denominations, between Israeli Jews and between American Jews, even amongst the Orthodox. I mean, there are so many conflicts between different Orthodox groups. We kind of think of the Orthodox as sort of monolithic, very far from it. So yes, in many ways, conflicts are good in that they keep people engaged, so to speak. And yet at the same time, conflicts also weaken people. The fact that, there's so much controversy at the Western Wall that, there's really no place for non-Orthodox Jews to pray. I mean, there's a little spot, but, so conflicts are good in that they keep people engaged, and yet they also are destructive in that they prevent unity when it matters. So I think you're right. Yeah. Who's next?
Sarah, we got Sarah.
Sarah, go ahead.
She might be having trouble with audio. Sarah,
Okay.
are you there?
Meredith, go ahead, then we'll wait to see if Sarah can.
I'm wondering if one of the reasons that the Essenes died out was because John the Baptist was such an important Essene leader in the early days of Christianity, and he pointed to someone coming after me who is greater than me. And it is well documented that many of his disciples abandoned John the Baptist and became disciples of Jesus. And so I'm wondering if that wasn't a very strong factor in the Essenes dying out, is that so many of them began to follow Jesus.
No question. The Essenes, they die out for a lot of reasons. And one of the big ones is many of them become followers of Jesus, and many become Pharisees, or at least, they return to that strict sect. And then they also die out because they don't have a sort of steady stream of future generations. I mean, they don't really have children. They relied on conversion for a while, but the Roman Empire became very unstable as well. And so during that time of instability, it's, their own practices probably changed. And yeah, I mean, the Essenes, it's still a mystery kind of why they fell apart, but I think a lot of it has to do with sort of the rise of Christianity and the decline of the Roman Empire. And essentially, by, let's say, 500 CE, there's really only the Pharisees and Christians, Jewish followers of Jesus. Those are the only groups left standing, and Jews are very small. In Judaism, I've said this before, there's really, the Judaism we practice today is Rabbinic Judaism. And Rabbinic Judaism is vastly different than Biblical Judaism. And Biblical Judaism was the religion of the Sadducees, the priests. Rabbinic Judaism is a religion of the Pharisees. And so we are, in a sense, heirs to the Pharisees. We all are, including the Orthodox. So now that you have this general picture, what we're going to do next week is go into a core conflict among the Pharisees, and that's the Maimonidean conflict. So Maimonides, I'll just give a little background now so you can kind of have a little bit what to look forward to. Maimonides takes a lot of the Pharisaic ideas and he modernizes them. He essentially says, the Pharisees still, they believed that prayer replaced sacrifice, but they also said sacrifice was the highest form of worship. Maimonides says, to be true, that God never really desired sacrifice. God always desired prayer. And Maimonides reinterprets all of Judaism with kind of some more abstract thinking. So we're going to go to that next week.
Can Sarah just try again really quick? I think she's ready.
Oh, good. Sure.
Sarah, go ahead.
Can you
Yep,
hear me
we can
now?
hear you. Yep.
Oh, great. I'm at someone else's house, so I apologize. I don't know the system very well. It seems to me that even the Rabbinic Judaism came from the Pharisees. We're kind of in reform, reverting to some things that the Sadducees had, in that it's a religion, it's pretty democratic. We're going more by Bible than the rabbinic commentaries in terms of some of the rules we keep. And it seems like we've kind of reverted almost more to a biblical Judaism in some ways in the Reform movement than the rabbinic traditions.
Yeah, that's a good point. That is how the early reformers saw it. They believed they were returning more to the prophets. They believed they were returning to prophetic Judaism. And truthfully, in certain Southern communities, like if you go to Atlanta or you go to Nashville, the big Reform synagogues are often called the temple. Now, the famous one is in Atlanta, the temple. And that is kind of biblical, a sense that this is not a synagogue, this is not a congregation, this is a central hub of Jewish life. And maybe some of the early Reform rabbis kind of dressed in not like priests, but in a kind of, the priesthood had special dress, and the rabbis of the classical Reform synagogues had certain dress. So yeah, I think you're right. But I would say that even the whole idea of how we, observe Shabbat and we study, all of that is really rabbinic. Not that the Sadducees didn't observe Shabbat, but it was a different kind of observance. It was much more focused on animal sacrifice and so forth, not study and refraining from activity. So yes, I think in theory, some of the early reformers were trying to return to biblical Judaism, but it was virtually impossible. Like our whole way of life is shaped by rabbinic thinking. So,
but we no longer are emphasizing resurrection.
true.
And we're no longer emphasizing, what was the other thing you said with the
Yeah, you're right.
Sadducees, afterlife. We're kind of
You're
downplaying
right.
afterlife again. So
You're right. Many of those are Sadducean principles. Yeah, great point. Great point. Well, thank you all. And it's great to see you, and see you next week, if not before.
thank you so much.